on the 4th of September to 6, 2024, at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, the 9th summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was held. Leaders from 53 African countries gathered in Beijing. This was the largest home diplomacy event China has hosted since the COVID-19 pandemic. At the opening ceremony, Xi Jinping announced that China will provide 360 billion yuan in financial support to Africa over the next 3 years. 360 billion yuan is roughly equivalent to $50.7 billion. When many people see this number, they immediately criticize it as wasteful spending, thinking that China is using money from its own people to please poorer African countries. But if you break down the 360 billion yuan, you will find that the situation is far less generous and far more complex than it appears on the surface. The 360 billion yuan is divided into 3 parts. The first part is 210 billion yuan in credit funds, accounting for nearly 60%. Note that this is not a grant and not aid, it is a loan. And this loan is not cash transferred directly to African countries for free use. It is a designated purpose credit line. What does that mean? For example, if you want to build a highway, you use this credit line to purchase Chinese steel, cement, construction, equipment, and hire Chinese engineering companies to build it. The money never leaves the Chinese system. Chinese steel mills get orders, Chinese construction companies get contracts, and China's excess capacity finds an export outlet. The road is built and it is yours, but the debt is also yours, and the operating rights or toll rights of this infrastructure in the future may be controlled by Chinese companies to repay the loan. This is the basic logic of what is called the debt trap. Once you use this credit, you owe China money. When you cannot repay it, you may have to transfer mines, ports, or infrastructure operating rights. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is a typical example because it could not repay its Chinese loans. The port's operating rights were leased to China for 99 years. Do African leaders not know this is a trap? They do, but they are willing to accept it because there are kickbacks in this kind of lending arrangement. This is not like borrowing from a bank where you have to bribe a loan officer. It is the opposite. China wants to lend you money, and political leaders receive personal benefits in order to sign the deal. The kickbacks are in US dollars and go into personal accounts, while the debt is in yuan and is borne by the state. For these ruling elites, this is a very good deal. The second part is 80 billion yuan, called various forms of aid. It sounds like real financial aid, but in reality it is heavily inflated. According to international development research institutions, this 80 billion yuan is a mixture of grants and concessional loans, and only a small portion is truly unconditional aid. A large part of it is the result of China's industrial overcapacity. Goods that cannot be sold domestically are shipped abroad under the name of aid and recorded at inflated prices. For example, a pack of instant noodles that costs 1 yuan to produce may be recorded as 8 yuan. What is the problem with that? Shipping costs are already low due to sea transport. So the actual value of the 80 billion yuan aid is difficult to determine. Of course, these goods do bring some practical benefits to African populations and help improve the image of Chinese companies locally. But calling it generous aid would be an exaggeration. The third part is no less than 70 billion yuan in investment from Chinese companies in Africa. This part is relatively real because it involves actual capital investment mines, ports, factories, and infrastructure. But precisely because it is real, it is also the most extractive part. Chinese state-owned enterprises and companies operate mines, roads, and infrastructure in Africa, creating some jobs, but also bringing environmental damage and labor issues. Many people who have been to Africa know that Chinese companies do not have a very good reputation locally. There is another important change in this summit. The 360 billion yuan commitment is denominated in RMB instead of US dollars. In previous China-Africa forums, including 2015, 2018, and 2021, the commitments were all denominated in US dollars. This shift to RMB is interpreted as an attempt by China to promote the internationalization of the yuan and reduce dependence on the US dollar. This is not a direct challenge to dollar dominance, but it can reduce the share of dollar settlement in China-Africa trade. The Beijing Declaration adopted at the summit also condemned sanctions imposed by Western countries on Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. For countries under sanctions, avoiding the dollar system is a necessity. Xi Jinping also announced a 100% tariff exemption for 33 least developed African countries that have diplomatic relations with China. It sounds generous, but in reality, African exports to China are almost non-existent in consumer goods. What can enter the Chinese market are mainly two categories: a small amount of agricultural products and a large amount of mineral resources. Zero tariffs on minerals are actually beneficial to China because it makes raw materials cheaper. So rather than a concession to Africa, this is more like a concession to China itself. After breaking all this down, the picture becomes clear. Out of the 360 billion yuan, about 60% is loan-based credit traps. More than 20% is inflated aid, and less than 20% is corporate investment. The amount of true unconditional assistance is extremely small, but you also cannot simply call this wasteful spending. China has its own clear strategic goals. The first goal is to absorb excess industrial capacity. With China's economy slowing down and domestic demand weak, factories are left with unsold goods. Through credit lines, this capacity is exported to Africa. The second goal is to secure resources. Africa's mineral resources are crucial to China's manufacturing sector. Through investment and loans, China secures long-term rights to mines and ports. The third goal is political influence. China needs support from 53 African votes in the United Nations and international organizations. As relations with the West become more tense, these votes become more valuable. The Beijing Declaration supporting China's positions is part of this exchange. The fourth goal is RMB internationalization. Using RMB-denominated credit forces African countries to use the yuan in trade settlement, gradually reducing reliance on the US dollar. So China's engagement in Africa is not simply charity or community of shared future for mankind. It is more like a business model with extractive characteristics, using loans to create leverage, using aid for public relations, using investment to secure resources, and using resources to gain political influence. African leaders receive kickbacks. African countries bear debt. African minerals and ports are gradually brought under Chinese control. As for those African leaders sitting in the Great Hall of the People shaking hands and taking photos with Xi Jinping, they understand this very well. This is not a sentimental story of South cooperation. It is a transaction where each side has its own interests. China wants resources, markets, and political support. They want us dollars in their personal accounts and short-term regime stability. As for who will repay the debt in the end, that is a problem for the next president.